a really long time since I've had a chance to sit down and do one of these videos, but this particular topic has been on my mind and my heart for a long time. The question of knowing our purpose in life, knowing the specific and unique calling that God has for each one of us. And I believe, especially within Christian circles, this has been a very popular question. It seems a lot of people want to know, what is my purpose in life? We want to live a purpose-driven life, and I'm not sure where this idea comes from that each of us has to know what our purpose is. I know for me, I went through a phase where I was really desperate to know my purpose, and I would pray to God. I would ask God to reveal to me what my purpose was. I felt like I really needed to know. I'm not sure why I felt this need, this urgency to know what my purpose was. Maybe I felt that if I knew my purpose, then somehow I would guarantee fulfilling that purpose. Maybe I felt like I would live a more meaningful life if I knew my purpose. I'm not really sure what motivated me, but I was really desperate to know what it was. And needless to say, I didn't quite figure it out, or I had some ideas in my mind, but in time I realized that, wait a minute, things are not falling into place the way that I thought they would. So was I right about what I thought my purpose was? I believe that sometimes, God will give us glimpses, bits and pieces of what He wants us to do at particular seasons in our lives. He will direct our steps. He'll open certain doors. He'll close certain doors. He'll guide us in a particular direction. But because we're so eager to see the big picture and see the grand design of what God is doing in our lives, God may lead us one step in a direction, and then we'll fill in all the blanks and come to a conclusion. Okay, yes, this is my purpose. I know for me, God led me into a specific career when I was doing my undergraduate studies, and in my mind I thought, okay, this is going to be the career that God has for me, that I will do for the rest of my life. And I ended up only working in that field for about 1.5 to 2 years. Now that I look back, I realized that God wasn't leading me in this career because this was the grand purpose that He had for my life. He wanted to bring me into a closer relationship with Him. And through this career, I moved into a city where I was integrated into a spiritual community in which I drew closer to God, and I grew in my relationship with God. So underneath all of that, He had a specific purpose for why He brought me into this career, not what I thought or what I envisioned in my mind. And I believe for a lot of us, God will lead us in particular areas of our lives, and we'll come to our own conclusion about some grand purpose that God has for our lives. And it may not necessarily be the case. We will not always see beginning to the end. Only God sees beginning to the end. He's the only one who understands the full picture. And most of the time, He might not reveal that full picture to us. And it's for us to just take it step by step, walk with God daily, and allow Him to lead our lives, allow Him to reveal to us what He wants to reveal to us in the time He wants to reveal it to us. He won't necessarily show us everything all at once because He's more interested in a relationship. When we look at biblical examples, there are people who did have an understanding of their purpose in life. We know that Moses, for example, he knew ahead of time that God had called him to deliver the Israelites from Egypt. He knew way before, decades before, he would actually fulfill that purpose. But him knowing that purpose didn't necessarily help him, because then he took it into his own hands. He took matters into his own hands. He felt like I'm going to be the deliverer. And he used violence, he used force, he killed the Egyptian. And it wasn't the right time. That wasn't how God wanted to deliver his people. And so he ended up shepherding in the wilderness for 40 years before God could actually use him to fulfill that purpose. So Moses, even though he knew his purpose, it didn't necessarily help him to fulfill it in any way. In fact, his knowledge got in the way of him just submitting to God and waiting on God's timing. We see examples of people who had a glimpse of what their purpose was. Joseph, for example, God gave him a dream that his brothers and his family would bow down to him, but he really did not understand how all of this would play out into the purpose that God had for his life. It wasn't until the end of everything, and if you're not familiar with this story, I would encourage you to go and look at it. It's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. And it wasn't until the end of everything that Joseph looked back and he said, this was why God sent me to Egypt. God sent me to Egypt so that I could preserve your lives. That was Joseph's purpose. And when we look at his life, he went through various seasons. When he first got to Egypt, he was in Potiphar's house and God elevated him, granted him favor. Then for another season, he was in prison. He was thrown in prison as a prisoner for something he didn't do. So Joseph could have looked at the events in his life and said, I don't know where my life is going. I don't understand what my purpose is. Why am I in prison? But God would be using all those circumstances and ordering them together, bringing them all together to fulfill this grand purpose that he had for Joseph's life, which was to use him to save the lives of his family, his entire family. And for many of us, we may be in a place, in a situation, in a season in our lives where we don't understand how things are going to fall into place. We don't understand where this is going, how God is working. We may not understand, we may not see it. But as Joseph remained faithful to God, that's all God calls us to do, is simply to remain faithful to him, regardless of whatever season we're in, regardless of whatever challenges, whatever difficulties we may be facing. God simply calls us to be faithful to him. And, we have an example of Mary, who had no idea at all that God would use her in the way that he did to be the mother of Jesus Christ, to carry Jesus in her womb, to nurse him when he was a baby, to raise him up and teach him the scriptures. She had no idea. Joseph had no idea that God would have that calling on their lives to be the parents of the Messiah. They were simply faithful to God. And because they were faithful to God, God could use them in that way. So maybe for us, we're so concerned about understanding all the details and seeing the big picture and knowing exactly how God is going to use us and what purpose he has for us. But maybe our question and our focus should be, God, am I faithful to you? Am I pleasing to you? Am I doing what you would have me to do? Am I submitting to your Holy Spirit? Because the other aspect of this question about purpose is the reality that we could fulfill a purpose that God has for us and still not be in right relationship with God. Pharaoh, for example, he fulfilled a purpose that God had. He fulfilled the purpose of God revealing his miraculous power to his people. God used Pharaoh's stubbornness to reveal his power to his people. So even though God used Pharaoh and Pharaoh fulfilled a purpose, that didn't benefit him in any way because he was not submitting to God. Even Paul himself says that he has to be careful that even though he preaches the gospel, he himself does not become a castaway, that he himself does not lose sight of his relationship with God. So we can be fulfilling a purpose for God and still not be in right relationship with God. That should be our focus. Am I living a life that is pleasing to God? And Solomon tells us in Ecclesiastes at the end of the book, he says, this is the whole duty of man is to fear God and keep his commandments. The purpose for every person, every human being on this planet is simply to live lives that are pleasing to God, to seek to honor God in everything that we do. We're also told in Ecclesiastes that whatever our hand findeth to do, we should do it with all our might. So whatever opportunities that we have, we should just simply be faithful, be diligent, do it with all our might. Do everything to the glory of God. Whatever situation we may find ourselves in, whether we are students studying in university, in high school, doing our master's or PhD, whether we are in a specific career and we're working in the corporate sector, whether we are mothers or wives at home taking care of our families, God calls us to do all to the glory of God, to seek to please him. At the end of the day, this should be our emphasis. And as we focus on pleasing God and just living lives that are submitted and wholly yielded to him, God will accomplish what he desires to through our lives. And many of us may not even see how God has used us until we get to heaven and he shows us the beautiful picture of our lives, and he shows us how he worked every situation to bring about the purpose that he had for our lives.